Okay, so you've sent us a fascinating chapter from an applied psychology textbook all about employee selection.
Absolutely.
Now, we know it's a bit dense, but don't worry, that's what we're here for.
We'll unpack the science behind how companies choose who to hire and maybe even bust some myths along the way.
We're going to dive deep into the most intriguing parts of employee selection.
It's true.
Whether you're applying for jobs, hiring someone yourself, or just curious about the HR world, this deep dive is for you.
The hiring process has evolved.
Speaking of myths, did you know that a recent study showed that 95% of companies conduct background checks?
Companies are using a whole arsenal of tools and techniques beyond just applications and reference checks.
Gone are the days when a quick glance at a resume was enough.
And some of these methods are pretty surprising.
It's not just about what's on paper anymore.
Exactly. Let's start with something many people wonder about. Resumes. We've all heard stories about people exaggerating their experience, but this chapter puts some numbers to it.
80%.
Did you know that a whopping 80% of job applicants admit to lying on their applications or during interviews?
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It's human nature to present ourselves in the best possible light.
But let's be real. Who hasn't embellished a little to make their resumes stand out?
But there are ways for employers to get a more accurate picture.
Okay, what's that?
The chapter talks about something called the elaboration technique.
Sounds complicated.
It's actually quite simple.
So it's like when you were a kid and your parents asked you what you did at school that day.
When you ask applicants to elaborate on their answers, providing more detail and specifics, they are much less likely to lie.
A simple nothing might work sometimes, but if they ask for details, you have to come up with a whole story.
Exactly.
It forces people to recall events more accurately, making it harder to fabricate.
That's really clever.
Okay, so we've talked about resumes, but what about those good old-fashioned reference checks?
Absolutely.
Are they still relevant in today's hiring world?
You might think they're a formality, but the truth is, companies take them very seriously and for good reason.
So it's not just about being thorough, it's about protecting themselves legally.
There's a legal concept called negligent hiring. Basically, if a company hires someone who then harms another person and the company didn't do a thorough background check, they could be held liable.
Exactly. And when done well, reference checks can be pretty revealing.
Structured telephone reference check.
There's a specific type of reference check called a structured telephone reference check that has been shown to be particularly effective.
What makes it different from a regular phone call?
Instead of having a casual conversation, these structured checks involve asking standardized questions to all references and then scoring their answers using a predetermined rating system.
So it takes the subjectivity out of it.
Right. One study focusing on customer service roles found that these structured reference checks were surprisingly accurate in predicting job performance. That's impressive. Okay, so resumes can be embellished, references can be insightful, but what about actually trying to measure someone's honesty?
It is, and it's where things get a bit more controversial.
I bet. So tell me more about these honesty tests. Do they actually work?
Well, the chapter dives into two main types: overt integrity tests and personality-based integrity tests.
Okay, I think I need those defined.
Overt integrity tests directly ask about your attitudes towards dishonest behavior, like stealing, and if you've done things like that in the past.
So one asks directly about honesty, and the other tries to figure out if you're the type of person who might be dishonest.
Personality-based ones are more subtle. They try to predict counterproductive work behaviors based on broader personality traits. Precisely. But there's a lot of debate about how accurate these tests really are and whether they're even ethical to use.
Yeah, I could see how those questions could feel very personal.
Right. And interestingly, research shows that women tend to score higher on honesty tests than men, but no one really knows why.
Now, that is a mystery for the ages.
It's a head-scratcher for sure. It makes you wonder about what these tests are actually measuring. But before we get lost in the debate about honesty, let's move on to another critical part of the hiring process: the interview.
Okay, the interview. It's the classic hiring tool, but this chapter dives into how subjective it can really be.
It's true. We all like to think we're excellent judges of character.
Give me an example.
But science tells a different story. Interviews are full of potential pitfalls and biases. Well, for starters, first impressions are incredibly powerful.
4 minutes.
One study found that interviewers solidify their opinion about a candidate in an average of just 4 minutes.
You barely have time to introduce yourself.
It's shocking, isn't it? And these snap judgments are often based on superficial things.
So you could be a perfect fit for the job, but if you spill coffee on yourself in the first 5 minutes, you're doomed.
Like appearance, handshake, or even a person's accent. It's a bit more nuanced than that, but you're not wrong. The chapter also talks about something called confirmation bias.
So if they decide early on that you're not a good fit, they might not even notice all the amazing things you bring to the table.
Once an interviewer forms an initial opinion, they tend to look for information that confirms that belief, even if it's not entirely accurate.
That's disheartening, but it also feels kind of human, you know? We all do that to some extent.
Exactly. They might focus on a small misstep or misinterpret something you say to fit their pre-existing idea.
Absolutely. We all have unconscious biases, and they can definitely influence our judgments, especially in a high-stakes situation like an interview.
So is there any way to make the interview process more objective?
There is. The chapter talks about something called structured interviews, which have been shown to be far more reliable and less prone to bias than traditional unstructured interviews.
Okay, so what makes an interview structured?
In a structured interview, all candidates are asked the same predetermined questions in the same order. And instead of just having a free-flowing conversation, interviewers use a standardized rating system to score each candidate's responses. So it's like taking a test, but instead of writing, you're talking.
That's a good way to put it. And because it removes a lot of the subjectivity, structured interviews are not only more fair, but they're also more legally defensible, which is a big plus for employers.
Makes sense. It sounds like the key takeaway here is that while interviews are still a valuable tool, we need to be aware of their limitations and strive for objectivity.
Exactly. Now, speaking of objectivity, let's talk about the role of technology in hiring. It's an area that's both exciting and a bit concerning.
Yeah, I was just about to say, we can't talk about the future of hiring without talking about AI.
Right. And the chapter brings up some really interesting points.
So instead of skimming through mountains of resumes, hiring managers could use AI to identify the most qualified candidates.
On one hand, AI has the potential to make hiring more efficient and even fairer by removing some of the human bias we've been talking about.
Exactly. AI can analyze resumes for relevant keywords and skills much faster and more accurately than a human can. Okay, that makes a lot of sense for the more administrative tasks. But can AI really replace human judgment when it comes to making a final hiring decision?
It can also be used to schedule interviews, send out rejection emails, and even conduct initial screening interviews through chatbots. That's the million-dollar question. And there are definitely some ethical considerations to keep in mind.
That's a scary thought. We wouldn't want to create a system that perpetuates existing inequalities.
For example, if the data used to train these AI algorithms is biased, then the AI itself will also be biased.
Absolutely. And that's why it's crucial that we develop these technologies responsibly and with a critical eye towards fairness and transparency.
It's like any new tool, it can be used for good or bad. It all depends on how we choose to wield it.
Precisely. Now, AI isn't the only technology shaking up the hiring landscape.
Asynchronous video interviews. What are those?
The chapter also touches on the rise of asynchronous video interviews.
Is that like Zoom, but not live? Exactly. Imagine recording your answers to preset interview questions on your own time, and then the hiring manager can watch your video whenever it's convenient for them.
So it's kind of like submitting a video audition for a job. That's both cool and kind of intimidating.
I know, right? It definitely changes the game.
I can see how that would be appealing, especially for people who get nervous during live interviews.
On the plus side, it offers flexibility for both applicants and employers. You can record your interview anytime, anywhere, and hiring managers can review those recordings at their own pace.
Right. And some people might feel like they can better showcase their personality and skills in a more controlled environment.
Why is that?
But research shows that job applicants are a bit skeptical of these asynchronous interviews.
That makes sense. It's like the difference between sending a text message and having a face-to-face conversation. You can convey a lot more through nonverbal cues and real-time responses. Well, some find them less engaging than a live conversation, and some worry about not being able to build rapport with the interviewer or stand out from the crowd when there's no live interaction.
Absolutely.
It sounds like the future of hiring is going to be all about figuring out which tools work best for each unique situation.
So, like with many things in the hiring world, it's about finding the right balance. Asynchronous videos offer convenience and efficiency, but they might not be suitable for every role or every company culture.
Exactly.
And that requires staying informed about the latest developments, understanding the potential benefits and drawbacks of each approach, and most importantly, never losing sight of the human element.
It's amazing how much the hiring landscape has changed, even in just the last few years. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into this chapter, what are the key takeaways? What should our listener remember?
That's a great question. Um, I think the most important thing to remember is that hiring at its core is about making decisions. And as we've discussed, those decisions can be influenced by a whole host of factors, some more objective than others. We've talked about resumes, reference checks, honesty tests, interviews, AI, video technology. It seems like the options are almost endless.
They are, and it can feel overwhelming for both job seekers and employers. But instead of getting lost in the sea of tools and techniques, I think it's helpful to remember that no single method is foolproof.
So there's no magic bullet, no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. It's about using a combination of methods, being thorough in your research and assessment, and most importantly, being mindful of potential biases at every step.
So self-awareness is key.
Absolutely. Both for job seekers and those doing the hiring, we need to be aware of our own biases and how they might be influencing our perceptions and decisions.
That's such an important point. It's easy to get caught up in what we think we know about someone based on a first impression, a resume, or even an algorithm's assessment. But the reality is, everyone deserves a fair shot.
I completely agree. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to, shed light on the complexities of the hiring process and to encourage everyone involved to approach it with a critical and discerning mind.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the psychology of lying on resumes to the potential of AI to revolutionize and maybe even complicate the way we hire. I hope our listeners walk away from this deep dive feeling more informed and empowered, whether they're on the job hunt or building a team of their own.
Me too. It's been a pleasure diving into this fascinating topic with you.
And a huge thank you to our listener for sending in this chapter and sparking such an engaging conversation. Remember, the future of hiring is being written every day. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged. This is The Deep Dive, signing off until next time.